The chandelier light fractured into 1,000 golden shards across the ballroom ceiling, each one trembling with the bass notes of a string quartet that played somewhere behind the wall of tuxedos and evening gowns. It was the kind of party that smelled like old money and new pretension, where champagne flutes never touched a surface before being swept away by gloved hands, and where every laugh carried the sharp undertone of someone calculating exactly how much the person beside them was worth. The Hargrove Foundation Gala, an annual spectacle held in the penthouse ballroom of the Meridian Grand in downtown Ashford, a city that wore its wealth like armor and its secrets like cologne. 400 of the most powerful people on the eastern seaboard had gathered under a ceiling painted with angels who looked down on mortals they had long stopped believing in. Savannah Okafor stood near the edge of the room, one hand resting lightly on the stem of a champagne glass she had not yet sipped from, her dark brown eyes scanning the crowd with the quiet alertness of someone who had learned to read rooms the way most people read books. She was stunning in a way that demanded attention without asking for it. A floor-length emerald gown that caught the light with every subtle shift of her body, her locks swept up in an architectural style that had taken her sister 2 hours to perfect over a video call that morning, and skin the color of burnished mahogany that glowed against the deep green silk, like something carved from earth and fire. But Savannah was not thinking about how she looked. She was thinking about how badly she wanted to leave. She had never been comfortable in spaces like this, rooms where the air itself felt curated, where conversations moved like chess games, and where every compliment came packaged with a calculation. She was a pediatric surgeon. Her world was tiny hearts and tinier hands, operating rooms that smelled like iodine and hope, and conversations with parents that required more courage than any ballroom ever could. She understood pressure. She understood stakes. But the pressure of keeping a 4-year-old alive on an operating table made infinitely more sense to her than the pressure of knowing which fork to use for the amuse-bouche. She was here for one reason and one reason only. Her husband had asked her to come. It had not been a demand. Never was with him. It had been a quiet request delivered over breakfast that morning, his hand covering hers across the kitchen table. "The Hargrove Gala is tonight. Bellamy Hargrove will be there. It would mean a great deal to me if you were beside me." That was all he had said. No explanation of why Bellamy Hargrove mattered. No briefing on the political dynamics at play. Just that quiet, simple sentence and the warmth of his hand on hers. And because Savannah loved him with a ferocity that still startled her after 7 years of marriage, she had said yes. Now she stood alone at the edge of a party she did not want to be at, waiting for him to return from whatever quiet conversation he had been pulled into 15 minutes ago, and wondering if anyone would notice if she slipped out to the terrace for some air that had not been breathed and rebreathed by 400 egos. She took her first sip of champagne, letting the bubbles dissolve against her tongue, and watched the crowd shift and rearrange itself like a living organism responding to invisible stimuli. She did not know it yet, but in exactly 11 minutes, her entire evening was going to change. Bellamy Hargrove was the kind of man who entered a room and expected it to rearrange itself around him. At 63, he had the build of someone who had once been athletic and was now simply large, his bulk carried with the confidence of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. His silver hair was swept back from a forehead that seemed permanently furrowed with displeasure, and his eyes, small and pale and constantly moving, had the quality of a predator scanning for weakness. He was, by most accounts, the wealthiest man in Ashford. His family had built their fortune in commercial real estate, pharmaceuticals, and a network of media holdings that gave him influence far beyond what his bank accounts alone could purchase. He sat on 11 boards, funded 3 political campaigns each cycle, and had a wing of the city's art museum named after his mother. In Ashford, Bellamy Hargrove was not merely rich, he was the infrastructure. Savannah noticed him approaching the way you notice a weather system rolling in from the horizon. There was a shift in the crowd, bodies parting subtly to create a path, heads turning with that particular mix of deference and anxiety that powerful men generate in social spaces. He was moving toward the bar, which happened to be exactly where she was standing, and he was flanked by two men who laughed at everything he said with the desperate enthusiasm of people whose livelihoods depended on it. She stepped aside to give them room, a small, courteous gesture that should have been invisible. But Bellamy Hargrove's eyes landed on her with the precision of a man who catalogued every face in every room and had already decided she did not belong. "Excuse me," he said, and his voice carried the particular volume of someone accustomed to being heard over everything. He was not speaking to her so much as speaking about her to the men beside him while looking in her direction. "I do not believe we have met, and I know everyone at this event." "Savannah Okafor," she said, extending her hand with a composure she did not entirely feel. "I am here with my husband." Hargrove did not take her hand. He looked at it, then looked at her, and then turned to one of his companions with an expression that managed to communicate amusement and dismissal simultaneously. "Okafor," he repeated, as though tasting the word and finding it unpleasant. "I am not familiar with that name. Is your husband in service? Catering, perhaps?" He gestured vaguely toward the wait staff circulating through the crowd, and one of his companions let out a short, nervous laugh. The insult landed with surgical precision, and Savannah felt it hit somewhere beneath her sternum, a cold, sharp point of pain that she refused to let reach her face. She had heard variations of this before. The assumption that a black woman at a wealthy event must be attached to someone who served rather than someone who belonged. It was an old wound, one she had thought she had built enough scar tissue around to protect herself. But something about the casual cruelty of it, the public nature of it, the way Hargrove had not even bothered to lower his voice, cut through her defenses like a scalpel through silk. "My husband is not in catering," she said, and her voice did not waver. "But I appreciate your interest." Hargrove raised an eyebrow, clearly unaccustomed to being answered with anything other than deference. "Then perhaps you could enlighten me, because this gala has a very specific guest list, and I do not recall approving any names I did not recognize." He leaned closer, close enough that she could smell the bourbon on his breath and the cologne that probably cost more than most people's car payments. "These events are not open to the public, sweetheart. If you wandered in from somewhere, I would suggest you wander back out before someone less polite than me notices." The word sweetheart hit her like a slap, not because it was loud or violent, but because of the velvet contempt wrapped around it, the absolute certainty in his voice that she was nothing, no one, a mistake that had somehow slipped past the gatekeepers of his carefully curated world. Around them, conversations had slowed. Heads were turning. The social radius of Bellamy Hargrove's voice extended far enough that at least 30 people had heard every word, and Savannah could feel their eyes on her like heat lamps. Some sympathetic, some curious, most simply grateful that they were not the ones standing in the blast zone. She opened her mouth to respond, to defend herself, to say something that would cut through his arrogance and remind him that she was a woman who held children's hearts in her hands for a living and did not need his permission to exist in any room on earth. But before she could speak, a voice came from behind her, quiet, calm, carrying the kind of authority that did not need volume because it had never needed to raise itself to be obeyed. "I see you have met my wife." Every head within earshot turned toward the voice, and Savannah felt the warmth of a familiar hand settle against the small of her back. Steady, grounding. A silent message that said, "I am here. I heard everything. And this man has no idea what he has just done." Kale Munseo had spent the better part of 2 decades learning how to control rooms without anyone realizing he was doing it. It was a skill born not from arrogance, but from necessity. the quiet discipline of a man who had grown up watching his grandmother run a textile empire from a back office in Incheon, while powerful men took credit for her work in the boardroom. She had taught him that true power was not the fist on the table, but the hand on the lever that no one could see. And Kale had learned that lesson so well that he had built an empire of his own that most people in this room did not even know existed. On paper, Kale Moon-seo was the CEO of Hanlim Pacific Group, a mid-sized investment firm with offices in Seoul and New York. Respectable, successful, unremarkable. The kind of company that appeared in the financial pages occasionally, but never made headlines, never drew attention, never invited the kind of scrutiny that would reveal what lay beneath the surface. What lay beneath the surface was considerably more interesting. Hanlim Pacific was the visible peak of a structure that extended deep into the foundations of Ashford itself. Kale owned, through a labyrinth of holding companies and blind trusts that would take a forensic accountant years to untangle, 43% of the commercial real estate in the city's downtown corridor. He held controlling interests in the Port Authority, the regional telecommunications infrastructure, and the private equity firm that had quietly acquired Ashford's largest hospital network 18 months ago. He was the silent investor behind the city's new waterfront development and the majority shareholder of the media conglomerate that published the newspaper Bellamy Hargrove read every morning with his coffee. In simple terms, Bellamy Hargrove thought he owned Ashford. Kale Moon-seo actually did. But Kale had not come to this gala to exercise power or settle scores. He had come because Bellamy Hargrove was a useful man to study, a loud, predictable variable in an equation Kale was quietly solving. The Hargrove Foundation controlled development rights to a stretch of waterfront property that Kale needed for the final phase of a project 3 years in the making. He had intended to spend the evening observing, gathering information, and leaving without making a single memorable impression. That plan had changed approximately 90 seconds ago when he returned from a conversation with a city councilwoman and heard Bellamy Hargrove suggest to his wife, in front of 30 witnesses, that she must be attached to the catering staff. Kale was not a man who experienced anger the way most people did. He did not flush or clench his fists or raise his voice. When something ignited the cold furnace at the center of his chest, the heat moved inward rather than outward, compressing itself into something dense and patient and infinitely more dangerous than any outburst. He had learned this from his grandmother, too. Rage is a resource, she had told him once, watching a competitor's company collapse under the weight of decisions she had engineered 6 months prior. Spend it wisely, and it will buy you everything. So when Kale placed his hand on Savannah's back and spoke those 6 words, his voice carried nothing but calm. No threat, no warning. Just a simple statement of fact delivered with the serene confidence of a man who knew exactly how the next several minutes were going to unfold. I see you have met my wife. He watched Bellamy Hargrove's face cycle through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion first, the gears of his social machinery trying to place this unfamiliar Asian man who had appeared beside the woman he had just dismissed. Then recognition, not of Kale himself, but of something in his bearing, his tailoring, the quiet authority in his posture that suggested this was not someone who could be brushed aside with the same casual contempt. And finally, uncertainty, the expression of a man who sensed he had miscalculated, but did not yet understand the magnitude of his error. "And you are?" Hargrove asked, and for the first time that evening his voice had lost some of its imperial certainty. Kale smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that a chess player allows himself when his opponent moves exactly the piece he expected them to move, the piece that opens the board for something the opponent cannot yet see. "Kyle Moon-seo," he said simply, "but we can discuss introductions later. Right now, I believe you owe my wife an apology." The word apology landed in the silence between them like a stone dropped into still water, and she could almost see the ripples of it spreading outward through every conversation within earshot. Bellamy Hargrove had not apologized to anyone in 27 years, and everyone in the room knew it. The silence that followed Cale's words was the kind that has weight, the kind that presses against your eardrums and makes you aware of your own breathing. 30, perhaps 40 people had stopped their conversations to watch. Champagne flutes frozen halfway to lips, smiles calcifying into masks of polite fascination. This was the real entertainment, the kind that no amount of string quartets and ice sculptures could compete with. Bellamy Hargrove drew himself up to his full height, which was considerable, and fixed Cale with a look that had cowed board members and politicians and journalists for the better part of 3 decades. It was a look that said, "I do not know who you are, but I know that you do not matter." "An apology," Hargrove repeated, as though Cale had suggested something mildly absurd, like paying for parking at his own building. "I think there has been a misunderstanding, Mr." He waved his hand vaguely, pretending he had already forgotten the name. "I was simply inquiring about your wife's presence at a private event. Security is a priority at these functions. I am sure you understand." "I understand perfectly," Cale said. His voice had not changed in volume or temperature. It remained exactly what it had been: calm, measured, carrying the particular stillness of a lake that conceals its depth beneath a motionless surface. "You saw a black woman standing alone at your party and assumed she did not belong. You suggested she was connected to the service staff. You called her sweetheart in a tone that was designed to diminish her in front of people whose opinions you believe matter." He paused, letting each observation settle into the air like evidence being entered into a record. "That is not a security concern, Mr. Hargrove. That is a choice you made, and I am giving you the opportunity to make a different one." Hargrove's face had begun to redden, a slow tide of color that started at his collar and crept upward like mercury in a thermometer. He was not accustomed to being spoken to this way, not in his own venue, not surrounded by his own people, not by a man whose name he did not recognize from any list that mattered to him. His eyes darted to the 2 men flanking him, seeking reinforcement, and found only carefully neutral expressions that offered nothing. "Now listen here," Hargrove began, his voice climbing toward a register that was meant to intimidate. "I have hosted this gala for 19 years. I will not be lectured on manners by someone who, forgive me, I have never heard of." He straightened his cufflinks, a gesture so practiced it was practically a tic. "Perhaps if your wife had introduced herself properly, or if your name carried any weight in this room, we would not be having this conversation." Savannah felt Cale's hand shift slightly against her back, the faintest increase in pressure, and she knew him well enough to understand what it meant. Not anger. Amusement. The specific amusement of a man who had just been told he carried no weight by someone standing inside a building he owned 37% of. She glanced up at her husband's face and saw the ghost of something playing at the corners of his mouth. Something that anyone else would miss but that she recognized instantly. It was the expression he wore when he was about to do something quietly devastating, the expression his business rivals had learned to dread, usually about 6 months too late. "You raise an interesting point," Cale said, and his tone had shifted almost imperceptibly, warming by exactly 1 degree, the way a cat's posture relaxes right before it moves. "Weight is a fascinating concept. It implies substance, permanence, the ability to affect the things around you." He reached into his jacket and produced a business card. Simple, white, bearing nothing but his name and a phone number, identical in its minimalism to the man himself. He held it out to Hargrove between 2 fingers. "I suspect that by tomorrow morning, you will have a much better understanding of how much weight my name carries. But the apology is not about weight, Mr. Hargrove. It is about decency, and that costs nothing." Hargrove looked at the card the way one might look at a parking ticket, with dismissive irritation and the absolute certainty that it could be made to disappear. He did not take it. Instead, he produced a laugh, loud and performative, designed to signal to the watching crowd that this exchange was beneath him. I admire your confidence, Mr. Munseo. Truly. But I think you will find that in this city, confidence without capital is just noise. He turned to his companions, clapping one of them on the shoulder. Come on, gentlemen. I believe the governor just arrived, and I would rather spend my evening with people whose names I will remember in the morning. He walked away without looking back, his entourage trailing behind him like debris in the wake of a ship, and the crowd parted for him exactly as it always did, because that was how gravity worked in Bellamy Hargrove's universe. Cale watched him go. Then he placed the untaken business card back in his pocket, turned to Savannah, and said, with perfect calm, "Would you like to dance?" Savannah stared at him. Dance? The quartet is playing Debussy. You love Debussy. Kyle, that man just humiliated me in front of half the city, and you want to dance? He humiliated himself, Kyle corrected gently. He simply does not know it yet. And I see no reason to let his ignorance ruin a perfectly good evening. Besides, his eyes softened in that way they only did when he looked at her, the way that still made her chest ache after 7 years. You wore that dress for a reason. It would be a crime not to dance in it. Against every rational impulse, against the anger still burning in her chest and the embarrassment still prickling at the backs of her eyes, Savannah felt herself laugh. It escaped before she could stop it, a short, startled sound that broke the tension like a window being opened in a room that had been sealed too long. You are impossible, she said. I have been told, Kyle replied, and offered her his hand. She took it. And as he led her onto the dance floor, pulling her close with one hand on her waist and the other holding hers with a tenderness that contradicted everything sharp and calculated about him, Savannah whispered, "You are going to destroy him, are you not?" Cale pressed his lips to her temple, a gesture so brief and gentle that no one watching would have read anything into it. But Savannah felt the words he murmured against her skin, felt them vibrate through her bones like a tuning fork struck against stone. Completely, he said, but not tonight. Tonight, we dance. The drive home was quiet in the way that only shared silence between two people who know each other completely can be. The city slid past the windows of the Aston Martin in streaks of rain and neon, and Savannah watched the lights blur and reform as Cale navigated through streets that were emptying as the hour approached midnight. She had kicked off her heels the moment she got in the car, tucking her feet beneath her on the heated leather seat, and she held her clutch in her lap with both hands like an anchor against the current of emotions still moving through her. Anger, humiliation, gratitude, and something else. Something that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and deciding whether to step back or lean forward. You do not have to do anything, she said, breaking the silence as they turned onto the boulevard that led to their neighborhood. About Hargrove. I mean it, Kyle. He is an ignorant man who said ignorant things, and I have survived worse than being mistaken for the help at a party I did not want to attend in the first place. Cale did not respond immediately. He downshifted as they approached a red light, the engine dropping to a low purr, and Savannah watched his profile in the intermittent glow of passing streetlights, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead when he was not in a room that required it to be immaculate, the quiet concentration in his eyes that could mean he was thinking about anything from a $4 billion acquisition to what he wanted for breakfast. He called you sweetheart, Cale said finally, and the word came out of his mouth like something he had been holding between his teeth, something that had edges. People have called me worse. Not in front of me. He said it simply, without drama, but Savannah heard the tectonic plates shifting beneath the surface of his composure. This was what most people never understood about Cale Munseo. They saw the calm, the control, the immaculate stillness, and they mistook it for indifference. But Savannah knew that beneath that surface was a man who felt everything with a depth that frightened him, A man who had spent his entire life learning to contain emotions that would consume lesser men. Kyle. She reached across the center console and placed her hand on his forearm, feeling the tension coiled in the muscle beneath his sleeve. Look at me. He glanced over, and she saw it there, the cold fire that she had seen only a handful of times in their marriage. Not rage. Something more refined. More patient. The kind of heat that did not burn, but rather forged. I am fine, she said firmly. He is not worth what you are considering. Whatever you are planning in that beautiful, terrifying brain of yours, I need you to promise me that it is not about vengeance. Because I did not marry a man who destroys people for sport, and I do not want to become the reason you turn into one. The light changed. Kale accelerated smoothly, and the city opened up ahead of them in ribbons of wet asphalt and reflected light. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that Savannah began to wonder if she had misjudged the situation, if perhaps he was not planning anything at all, and she had projected her own fantasies of retribution onto his silence. Then he took her hand from his arm and brought it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that was so tender it made her eyes sting. It is not about vengeance, he said quietly. It is about the fact that a man who treats strangers the way Bellamy Hargrove treated you tonight does not do it for the first time at 63. He does it because no one has ever made him stop. He laced his fingers through hers. I am not going to destroy him, Savannah. I am going to show him what he has been standing on, and then I am going to let gravity do the rest. She should have argued. She should have pressed harder, demanded specifics, insisted on boundaries. But the truth was, she believed him. And the darker truth, the one she would not admit to anyone, not even herself, was that some part of her wanted to watch Bellamy Hargrove discover exactly how small he really was. They had met 8 years ago in the pediatric intensive care unit of Weston Memorial Hospital, and the story of how a Korean investment magnate ended up sitting in a plastic chair beside a 4-year-old's bed at 3 in the morning was, like most things about Kale, considerably more complicated than it appeared. His niece, Yuna, the daughter of his younger sister Mireille, had been born with a congenital heart defect that had gone undetected until she collapsed at a playground in Queens on a Tuesday afternoon. By the time Kale arrived at the hospital, having abandoned a meeting with the board of a major shipping company mid-sentence, Yuna was already in surgery, and Mirai was sitting in the waiting room with the hollowed-out expression of a mother who had been told that her daughter's survival was a matter of probability rather than certainty. Savannah had been the surgeon. She was 31 then, 2 years into her attending position, still burning with the raw intensity of a doctor who had not yet learned to build the emotional walls that experience would eventually demand. She had spent 11 hours inside Yuna's chest, repairing a septal defect that was more complex than the imaging had suggested, improvising solutions to complications that arose mid-procedure, and operating with a precision that her supervising physician would later describe in a letter of recommendation as bordering on artistry. Yuna survived, but the first 24 hours after surgery were critical, and Savannah had made a habit, one her colleagues considered either admirable or pathological depending on their perspective, of staying with her youngest patients through the night. So when Kale finally made it past the nurse's station at 2:45 in the morning, armed with a combination of charm and stubbornness that the night staff had never encountered in that particular concentration, he found his niece sleeping peacefully in a bed surrounded by monitors, and a woman in surgical scrubs asleep in the chair beside her, one hand resting on the bed rail as though maintaining a physical connection to her patient even in unconsciousness. He stood in the doorway for a long time, watching them both breathe. He had expected to find Yuna surrounded by machines and clinical indifference. Instead, he found this, a doctor who had stayed, who had given up her own rest to keep watch over someone else's child, who slept with her hand on the bed rail like a promise. He sat down in the second chair, the one on the other side of Yuna's bed, and he waited. When Savannah woke up an hour later, disoriented and embarrassed, she found a tall Korean man in a rumpled suit sitting across from her, reading something on his phone with one hand, while his other hand rested on the bed rail in an unconscious mirror of her own posture. "You should not be in here," she said, her voice still thick with sleep. "You should not be sleeping in chairs," he replied without looking up. "It is terrible for your spine." "I am serious. Visiting hours do not start until 7. And yet, here we both are." He looked up then, and Savannah was struck by two things simultaneously. First, that he had the most controlled face she had ever seen, every feature arranged with a precision that suggested a lifetime of practice. And second, that his eyes, dark and steady and entirely too perceptive, were looking at her with something that was not quite gratitude and not quite curiosity, but something that lived in the space between them. "You saved her life," he said. It was not a question. "I did my job. Your job ended when the surgery was over. This," he gestured at the chair, the bed rail, the fact of her presence. "This is something else." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, which turned out to be exactly the right response because Kale Munseo was a man who understood silence better than most people understood conversation. He came back the next night, and the night after that. Kale appeared each evening with the reliability of a tide, always at the same time, always sitting in the same chair, always reading something on his phone while maintaining that quiet vigil that Savannah initially found intrusive, then tolerable, then oddly comforting. They talked gradually, in the way that people talk when they are sharing a small room and a large silence, and neither of them has anywhere else to be. He asked about her work, her training, what had drawn her to pediatric surgery specifically. She asked about Yuna, about his family, about the way he spoke Korean to his niece in soft musical tones that made the beeping monitors sound harsh by comparison. He never told her what he did for a living. When she asked, he said simply, "I move things from where they are to where they should be," which was vague enough to be meaningless and specific enough to be intriguing, and Savannah found herself thinking about it long after visiting hours ended and the PICU returned to its nighttime hum of machines and whispered consultations. On the 7th night, Yuna was well enough to be moved to a regular ward, and Savannah no longer had a medical reason to be in the room. She was walking to her car in the hospital parking garage, exhausted and oddly deflated, when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Kale standing under the fluorescent lights with his hands in his pockets, and an expression on his face that she would later describe as the closest thing to uncertainty she had ever seen him display. "Yuna is asking for you," he said. "She wants you to read her a story. It is 11:30 at night. She is 4. She does not understand clocks." Savannah looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time seeing past the composed exterior to the man underneath. A man who had sat in a hospital for a week because his niece needed him. A man who remembered that Savannah had mentioned once, in passing, that she had wanted to be a children's book author before she wanted to be a surgeon. A man who was standing in a parking garage at 11:30 at night, asking her to come read a story to a 4-year-old, and somehow making it sound like the most important invitation she would ever receive. "What story?" she asked. And Kale smiled. Not the controlled, calibrated expression he used in professional settings. A real smile, sudden and unguarded, that cracked the composure of his face like sunlight breaking through overcast sky. "She says you can choose," he said. "But nothing with wolves. She has opinions about wolves." Savannah laughed, and in that laugh, in that single, surprised sound echoing off the concrete walls of a hospital parking garage, something began that neither of them had planned for, and neither of them would have traded for anything in the world. They were married 14 months later, in a ceremony so private that only 11 people attended, on a cliff top in Jeju Island with the sea crashing below them, and Yuna serving as flower girl in a dress she had chosen herself. Bright yellow with a pattern of strawberries that clashed magnificently with everything. Bellamy Hargrove did not apologize. What he did instead was considerably more predictable and infinitely more foolish. Within 48 hours of the gala, Savannah began to feel the ripples. It started with small things, the kind of social microaggressions that were designed to be deniable but unmistakable. An invitation to a medical conference she had been confirmed for 6 months ago was quietly rescinded, the organizer citing scheduling conflicts in an email so brief it bordered on hostile. A colleague at the hospital mentioned, with the careful casualness of someone delivering a warning disguised as gossip, that Savannah's name had come up at a board meeting in a context that was not entirely positive. A patient's family, wealthy donors to the Hargrove Foundation, requested a different surgeon for their son's procedure, offering no explanation beyond a tight-lipped, "We have decided to go in another direction." The message was clear. Bellamy Hargrove had decided that the woman who had embarrassed him at his own gala, or more accurately, the woman whose husband had embarrassed him, needed to be reminded of the natural order of things. And in Ashford, the natural order meant that Bellamy Hargrove stood at the top, and everyone else arranged themselves according to his pleasure. Savannah absorbed each blow with the stoic professionalism she had cultivated over a decade of working in environments where she was often the only black woman in the room. She did not complain. She did not confront. She went to work. She operated on children's hearts. And she came home to a husband who watched her with increasingly focused attention, the way a seismologist watches instruments before an earthquake. But the weight of it accumulated in places she did not expect. She found herself hesitating before entering the hospital cafeteria, scanning the room for faces that might turn away when she sat down. She noticed the way certain colleagues greeted her with a fraction less warmth than before, the way conversations dimmed when she approached, the way invitations to after-shift drinks that had once been automatic now came with a pause that lasted just long enough to be noticed. It was not ostracism. Not yet. It was something subtler and in many ways crueler, a slow recalibration of her social standing that happened in increments too small to confront, but too large to ignore. The hardest part was the doubt. No doubt in herself, she knew her skill, knew the hundreds of children who were alive because of what her hands could do. But doubt in whether skill alone was enough to withstand the kind of institutional pressure that Bellamy Hargrove could bring to bear. She had spent her entire career believing that excellence was its own armor. And now a man who could not tell a scalpel from a butter knife was proving that belief wrong, one quietly closed door at a time. She did not tell Cale about the rescinded invitation. She did not tell him about the board meeting or the transferred patient. She knew, with the certainty of a woman who understood her husband the way she understood cardiac anatomy, that each piece of information would become fuel for a response she was not sure she wanted to ignite. But Cale found out anyway. He always did. It was Mirai who told him, calling from New York with the righteous fury of a younger sister who had overheard something at a charity luncheon that connected Hargrove's name to a whisper campaign targeting Savannah's professional reputation. The accusation, never spoken directly but implied with the precision of a knife slid between ribs, was that Dr. Okafor had obtained her position through connections rather than competence, that her surgical outcomes were inflated, that the hospital would be wise to conduct a quiet review of her credentials. None of it was true. All of it was damaging. Cale listened to his sister's account without interruption, sitting in his home office with the phone pressed to his ear and his eyes fixed on a photograph on his desk. The photograph showed Savannah on their wedding day, laughing at something Una had said, her head thrown back, and her eyes closed, and her entire body radiating a joy so pure it hurt to look at. He studied that photograph while Mirai talked, and his face did not change expression once, and anyone who knew him well enough to read the absence of expression would have recognized it as the most dangerous version of Kale Munseo there was. "Thank you, Mirai," he said when she finished. "I will handle it." Kale. His sister's voice carried a warning she had earned the right to deliver through 30 years of knowing him. "Do not do anything that makes the situation worse." "I never make situations worse," Kale said calmly. "I make them different." He hung up and sat in silence for a long time. The photograph before him, the city sprawling beyond his window, the architecture of Bellamy Hargrove's retaliation assembling itself in his mind with the clarity of a blueprint being unrolled on a table. Then he opened his laptop, made 3 phone calls that lasted a combined total of 14 minutes, and went downstairs to help Savannah with dinner, as though nothing in the world had changed. But something had changed. A clock had started. And Bellamy Hargrove, who was at that moment enjoying a scotch in his study and congratulating himself on the elegant efficiency of his social machinery, had no idea that the ground beneath his feet had already begun to shift. The pressure found them in the spaces between. Not in the big moments, not in the obvious places, but in the quiet gaps where a marriage lives and breathes. The half-second pause before Kale answered her questions about his day. The way Savannah started closing her office door to take phone calls she would have previously taken in front of him. The imperceptible widening of a distance that neither of them acknowledged, because acknowledging it would make it real. Savannah noticed it first, the way she always noticed things first, because paying attention was her profession and her pathology. Kale was working later. His phone rang more frequently, and he stepped out of rooms to answer it with an apologetic smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was gentle with her, attentive, present in all the ways that mattered. But there was a partition behind his gaze that she could feel even when she could not see it, a tinted window that obscured whatever machinery was operating on the other side. She knew what he was doing. She did not know the specifics, did not know the shape or scale of whatever response he was constructing, but she knew Kale the way a navigator knows the sea. She could read the currents beneath his surface, and what she read now was a man in motion, a man who had set something irreversible into play. And it frightened her. Not because she doubted him, but because she had seen, in rare and terrible glimpses over the course of their marriage, what Kale was capable of when he decided that someone he loved had been threatened. There was a coldness in him that existed alongside the warmth, a compartment he kept sealed and separate from the man who read bedtime stories to Yuna and slow danced with his wife in the kitchen at midnight. She loved him entirely, both the warmth and the cold. But she did not love what the cold turned him into when it was unleashed. And she was afraid that by failing to stop Hargrove's campaign against her, by absorbing it silently instead of confronting it, she had given the cold permission to emerge. The fracture surfaced on a Thursday evening over something so mundane it almost felt insulting. They were making dinner together, a ritual they had maintained since the first year of their marriage, and Savannah asked him to pass the gochugaru. He did not hear her. He was looking at his phone, his face illuminated by the screen's pale light, his expression locked in that particular configuration of focused attention that meant he was reading something that mattered. Kale. He looked up, and for a fraction of a second, before his composure reassembled itself, she saw something in his eyes that she recognized from the operating room. It was the look of someone managing a crisis, calculating variables, running through scenarios that all ended in places he did not want to go. "Where are you right now?" she asked, and she did not mean it geographically. He set the phone face down on the counter. "I am here. I am right here. Your body is here. The rest of you has been somewhere else for 2 weeks." She turned off the stove, because this was not a conversation to have while something was cooking, and faced him fully. "Talk to me. Whatever you are doing about Hargrove, whatever you are planning, I need to know, because I can handle the man at the party. I have been handling men like him my entire life. What I cannot handle is being shut out by the person who promised to never do that." Cale was quiet, and in his silence, Savannah could hear the war between the parts of him. The part that wanted to protect her by keeping her separate from the ugliness of what he was doing, and the part that knew she was right, that their marriage survived on transparency the way her patient survived on oxygen, and that cutting off the supply would kill something vital even if his intentions were to preserve it. "He is trying to have your surgical privileges reviewed," Cale said finally. "He has a contact on the hospital's credentialing committee. The review would be quiet, unofficial, but it would create a record, a shadow on your file that would follow you to every institution you ever applied to." The words hit Savannah like a body blow, not because she had not suspected something like this, but because hearing it spoken aloud made it irrevocable. Her surgical privileges. The thing she had spent 15 years building, the credential that represented not just her career, but her identity. The proof that the girl from Macon, Georgia, who had dissected frogs in her grandmother's kitchen with a steak knife and a library book had become someone who could hold a child's heart in her hands and make it beat again. Hargrove was not just trying to embarrass her, he was trying to erase her. "And what are you doing about it?" she asked, her voice steady even as something inside her cracked. Cale met her eyes. "What I do best," he said. "I am making it so that by the time the review committee convenes, Bellamy Hargrove will no longer have the authority to influence anything in this city, including the weather." The call came at 6:14 on a Saturday morning, the kind of hour that announces itself as emergency before a single word is spoken. Savannah was in the kitchen, still in the oversized shirt she slept in, grinding coffee beans with the mechanical precision of someone who was not yet fully conscious. Cale had already been awake for an hour, which she knew because his side of the bed had been cool when she reached for him, and his laptop was open on the dining table with spreadsheets visible on the screen. His phone rang. He answered it with the same calm he answered everything, but Savannah watched his face change in ways that most people would not have detected. A tightening at the corners of his mouth, a stillness in his eyes that went beyond focus into something approaching alert. He spoke in Korean, rapid and low, and she caught fragments she had learned to recognize over 7 years of marriage. Mirai's name, the word for hospital, the word for now. He hung up and looked at her, and in his face she saw something she had seen exactly twice before, both times preceding events that had fundamentally altered the landscape of their lives. "Mirai and Yuna were in an accident," he said. His voice was level, but his hands were not. "Their car was forced off the road near the bridge on Haverford. Mirai has minor injuries. Yuna is being taken to Ashford General." The coffee grinder was still running. Savannah turned it off, and the sudden silence felt like a held breath. "Forced off the road," she repeated. "Not an accident." "No." The single syllable carried the weight of everything Cale had been managing in silence for the past 3 weeks. Not an accident. They were at the hospital in 12 minutes. Cale drove with a controlled intensity that Savannah had never seen before, taking corners with a precision that suggested he was channeling every ounce of his considerable discipline into the act of not falling apart. Mirai was in the emergency department, her left arm in a sling and a cut above her eyebrow held together with butterfly strips, and the moment she saw her brother, the composure she had been maintaining for the paramedics and the triage nurses dissolved into rapid, breathless Korean that Savannah could follow only in fragments. A dark SUV, no plates, deliberate. Yuna was in the back seat. The car hit the barrier. Yuna hit her head. Cale held his sister, one hand cradling the back of her head, and looked at Savannah over Mirai's shoulder with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was the face of a man who had just discovered the location of a line he did not know he had, and realized that someone had crossed it. Yuna was in the pediatric unit, conscious but disoriented, with a concussion that the attending physician assured them was moderate and manageable. She was 12 now, long past the tiny patient Savannah had once held open on an operating table. But when she saw her aunt walk into the room, she reached out with both hands and said, "Auntie Sova, my head has a thunderstorm in it." And Savannah felt something rupture in her chest that no amount of surgical training had prepared her to repair. She sat with Yuna while Kyle stepped into the hallway to make phone calls. Through the glass partition, she watched him pace, his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand running through his hair in a gesture she recognized as the physical manifestation of a mind operating at a speed the body could not match. He made 4 calls. Each one was shorter than the last. The final one lasted 11 seconds. When he came back into the room, he was different. Not outwardly, not in any way that the nurses or doctors would have noticed, but Savannah saw it the way she saw arrhythmias on a monitor, a fundamental change in rhythm that signaled something critical. "It was Hargrove," he said quietly, standing beside her while Yuna dozed fitfully in the bed. "Not directly. He does not have the nerve for direct. But the SUV was registered to a security firm that contracts exclusively with Hargrove Properties. The driver has worked personal detail for Bellamy Hargrove for 9 years. He tried to hurt Yuna," Savannah said, and her voice came out in a register she did not recognize, low and flat, and stripped of every layer of professional composure she had spent a decade building. "He went after a child because you embarrassed him at a party." "Because I asked him to apologize to you," Cale corrected, and the precision of the distinction mattered because it meant that all of this, every consequence that had cascaded from that evening, originated in a single act of casual cruelty directed at a woman who had done nothing more than exist in a space where Bellamy Hargrove had decided she did not belong. They stood in silence, watching Eunice sleep, and something inside Savannah shifted. The architecture of restraint she had been urging on her husband crumbled like a condemned building finally surrendering to gravity. She had asked him not to act from vengeance. She had asked him to be better than the impulse to destroy. And she had meant it. Every word. Because she believed in the version of Cale who chose precision over brutality and strategy over rage. But that was before Hargrove had put his hands on their family. That was before Yuna's thunderstorm. "Do it," she said. Cale looked at her. "Whatever you have been building, whatever you have been holding back because I asked you to, do it." She met his eyes, and she let him see everything: the anger, the fear, the love, the fierce and terrible certainty that some acts could not be answered with patience. "He came for our family, Kyle. That is not a line you step back from. That is a line you end." Cale studied her face for a long moment, and what he saw there must have confirmed something he had been waiting for, because when he nodded, it was with the finality of a key turning in a lock that would never open again. "It will be done by Monday," he said. "Not by Monday," Savannah replied. "By Monday morning. I want him to wake up to it." Cale looked at her with an expression she had never seen before, a compound of love and admiration and something that might have been awe, as though he was seeing a dimension of the woman he married that he had always suspected existed, but had never witnessed in full. "Monday morning," he agreed. And he kissed her forehead, and his lips were warm against her skin, and outside the window the city hummed with the oblivious energy of a place that did not yet know it was about to change hands. Savannah's grandmother, Odessa Kinlaw, had been dead for 4 years, but she had left behind a voice that lived in the walls of Savannah's memory like a tenant who had paid rent in advance for eternity. It was Odessa who had taught Savannah to hold a scalpel, though she had called it a paring knife, and the patient had been a Thanksgiving turkey. It was Odessa who had driven her to her first anatomy class at Spelman, sitting in the parking lot for 3 hours because she did not trust the bus schedule and did not want her granddaughter to worry about getting home. and it was Odessa who had told her, on the night before her wedding, the only piece of marital advice she had ever offered. "You are marrying a man with deep water in him," Odessa had said, sitting on the edge of Savannah's bed in the hotel room in Jeju, her arthritic hands folded in her lap and her eyes carrying the particular clarity of someone who has lived long enough to stop being surprised by anything. "I have known men like that. Your grandfather was one. Deep water men are beautiful, and they are steady, and they will carry you further than you ever imagined. But deep water has currents, child. And if you do not learn to swim in his currents, they will carry you somewhere you did not choose to go." Savannah had smiled and kissed her grandmother's cheek, and filed the advice in the category of poetic but impractical wisdom that elderly women dispensed at weddings. She had been 32 years old and in love, and certain that she understood the man she was about to marry as completely as any person could understand another. She had been wrong. Not about Kale, but about the depth of the water. Now, sitting in the hospital room beside Yuna's bed, while her husband systematically dismantled the empire of a man who had threatened their family, Savannah heard her grandmother's voice as clearly as if Odessa were sitting in the chair beside her. Deep water has currents. She was swimming in them now. She could feel them pulling, feel the momentum of Kale's response carrying both of them toward a destination she could not fully see. And for the first time since she had said, "Do it," she paused long enough to ask herself whether she was swimming or drowning. The answer, when it came, arrived not in Odessa's voice, but in Savannah's own. It was the voice she used in the operating room, the voice that cut through chaos and found the essential truth beneath the noise. She was swimming. She had been swimming her entire life, through medical school on scholarships and prayer, through residency programs that tested her endurance and her dignity in equal measure, through 7 years of marriage to a man whose world operated on principles she was still learning to navigate. She had not drowned yet, and she was not going to drown now. But she would swim with her eyes open. That was the part Odessa had been trying to tell her, the part she had not understood at 32 but understood perfectly at 39. Loving a man whose depths she could never fully chart did not mean surrendering to his currents. It meant knowing where they were taking you and choosing, every single day, whether that direction was one you could live with. She could live with this. Bellamy Hargrove had targeted a child. Her child in every way that mattered, because Yuna had been hers from the moment she had held that tiny heart in her hands 8 years ago and refused to let it stop beating. And a woman who could hold a child's heart and make it beat again was not a woman who would apologize for protecting what she loved. Odessa would have understood. Odessa, who had once chased a man off her property with a cast-iron skillet and a vocabulary that made the neighbors close their windows, would have understood perfectly. Monday morning arrived the way Savannah had requested, with precision. At 6:45, before Bellamy Hargrove had finished his first cup of coffee, the financial news outlets began publishing simultaneously. Not one story, but 4, appearing across different platforms with the coordinated timing of a symphony orchestra hitting its opening chord. The first story was straightforward. Hanlim Pacific Group, a previously low-profile investment firm, had completed the acquisition of Meridian Holdings, the parent company that owned the Meridian Grand Hotel, the venue where the Hargrove Foundation Gala had been held for 19 consecutive years. Effective immediately, the annual event would need to find a new venue, as the hotel's event calendar was being restructured to accommodate new ownership priorities. The acquisition had been finalized 6 days ago. No one had been informed. The second story required more careful reading but carried considerably more force. A regulatory filing revealed that Kyle Munseo, through a subsidiary of Hanlim Pacific, had acquired a controlling interest in the pharmaceutical distribution company that supplied 87% of the products sold through Hargrove Pharmaceuticals' retail network. The terms of the existing supply contract were under review. No decisions had been made, but the implication was the kind of silence that speaks louder than any statement. The third story was the one that would have made Savannah's grandmother smile. A prominent media analytics firm, retained by an unnamed client, had published a comprehensive audit of the Hargrove Foundation's charitable giving over the past decade. The audit revealed that of the $200 million Hargrove had publicly claimed to raise, approximately 61% had been directed to organizations in which Hargrove or his family held board positions, financial interests, or both. The report did not use the word fraud. It did not need to. The numbers told a story that no amount of public relations could rewrite. The fourth story was the smallest and the quietest and the most devastating of all. It was not a news article, but a letter, delivered by courier to Bellamy Hargrove's home address at precisely 7 o'clock, on stationery so simple it bore only a name and a phone number. The letter informed Mr. Hargrove that his commercial real estate portfolio, the bedrock of his family's wealth, and the source of his influence in Ashford for over 3 decades, was significantly more leveraged than he realized. Specifically, that the banks holding his primary mortgages had, over the past 18 months, sold those mortgage instruments to a series of investment vehicles that were, upon close examination, all controlled by the same entity. That entity was Hanlim Pacific Group. The letter did not make threats. It did not demand anything. It simply stated facts, calmly, precisely, the way a doctor might explain a diagnosis, and concluded with a single sentence that Savannah would later learn Cale had written himself longhand at the kitchen table while she slept. "I believe we have a conversation to finish, Mr. Hargrove. My wife's name is Dr. Savannah Okafor. I trust you will remember it." Bellamy Hargrove read the letter 3 times. Then he made 4 phone calls. The first was to his attorney, who confirmed what the letter suggested and added several details that made it considerably worse. The second was to his banker, who spoke in the strained, apologetic tones of a man delivering a terminal prognosis. The third was to a political contact who had always been reliable in the past, but who now expressed, with carefully worded regret, that certain relationships were being re-evaluated in light of recent developments. The fourth call went unanswered. It was to the private security firm whose employee had driven a dark SUV into the side of a car carrying a woman and a child near the bridge on Haverford. By 9:30, Bellamy Hargrove was sitting in his study with a tumbler of scotch he had not yet touched, staring at a name on a business card he should have accepted 3 weeks ago, and experiencing for the first time in 27 years the sensation of being completely and utterly outmaneuvered by someone he had dismissed as irrelevant. He walked to his window and looked out at the city he had always considered his. The skyline was the same. The buildings still bore the names he recognized, but the view felt different now, the way a house feels different when you realize the deed is in someone else's name. Everything he could see was threaded through with the invisible filaments of a man he had laughed at 3 weeks ago. A man who had smiled at the laughter and said nothing, because he had not needed to. Hargrove thought about his father, a man who had built the family's fortune with a simple philosophy: control what people need, and they will never say no to you. It had been reliable for decades, but it assumed you could identify what people needed, and Bellamy Hargrove had never considered the possibility that someone might need nothing from him at all. That was the part that stung most. Not the financial exposure, not the foundation audit, not even the criminal liability hovering over the incident on Haverford Bridge. It was the realization that Kyle Munseo had never needed anything from him. The only thing Cale had ever wanted was a single word spoken to a woman in a green dress, and Bellamy had been too proud to give it. At 10:15, his phone rang. "Mr. Hargrove." Cale's voice was exactly as it had been at the gala. Calm, unhurried, carrying the particular authority of a man who did not need to raise his voice because the architecture of his power did the speaking for him. I hope you have had a chance to review the materials I sent. What do you want? Hargrove's voice had lost every trace of the imperial certainty that had defined it for decades. It was the voice of a man who had looked down and discovered that the ground he stood on was not ground at all. I want what I wanted 3 weeks ago, Cale said. An apology to my wife, a public one, at an event of her choosing in front of people whose opinions she values. And I want the individual who drove the vehicle that struck my sister's car, arrested and charged, along with whoever authorized the action. Silence on the line. Then, and if I do these things? The mortgages, the pharmaceutical contracts, the foundation audit? The mortgages will be restructured on favorable terms. The supply contracts will be renewed without interruption. And the foundation audit? Well, the audit contains only facts, Mr. Hargrove. What happens with facts is generally determined by how the person they describe chooses to respond to them. Another silence, longer this time, filled with the sound of a man recalculating his entire understanding of the city he thought he owned. You could have destroyed me, Hargrove said finally, and there was something in his voice that almost resembled wonder. You had everything in place. You could have pulled every lever and buried me, and no one would have stopped you. Why didn't you? Cale was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried something Savannah would have recognized immediately, the warmth that existed alongside the cold, the part of him that chose precision over annihilation, not because he lacked the capacity for destruction, but because he had decided, long ago, that building was harder and more worthy than breaking. Because my wife asked me not to, Cale said simply. She asked me to show you what you were standing on and let gravity do the rest. I have shown you. The gravity is yours to manage. But Mr. Hargrove, I want to be very clear about one thing. His voice did not harden. It did not need to. If you come near my family again, if you so much as speak my wife's name in a room she is not in, I will not make phone calls. I will not write letters. I will simply buy everything you have ever touched and rename it. And you will spend the rest of your life watching your legacy disappear one building at a time. Do we understand each other? Yes, Bellamy Hargrove said. And for the first time in 27 years, the word tasted like what it was. Surrender. The apology came 2 weeks later at a fundraiser for the Children's Wing of Weston Memorial Hospital, an event that Savannah had chosen with the deliberate precision of a surgeon selecting the point of incision. Bellamy Hargrove stood at a podium in front of 300 people, most of whom had heard some version of what had happened at the gala, and delivered a speech that was clearly written by someone other than himself, but that he read with surprising sincerity. He spoke about assumptions, about the cost of arrogance, and he spoke her name, her full name, Dr. Savannah Okafor, with the careful enunciation of a man who understood that this particular combination of syllables now carried a weight he would never again underestimate. Savannah stood in the audience beside Cale, his hand warm against the small of her back, and listened to a man who had tried to erase her say her name in front of a room full of people who mattered. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel vindicated. She felt tired. The specific tiredness of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was finally setting it down. When Hargrove finished, the applause was polite but genuine, and Cale's thumb traced a small circle against her spine, a gesture so subtle that no one else would have noticed. She looked up at him and found him watching her with that expression she had first seen under fluorescent lights in a hospital 8 years ago. The one that was not quite gratitude and not quite curiosity, but something that lived in the space between them. How do you feel? He asked quietly, his lips close to her ear. Like I want to go home and eat something that is not served on a tray by someone wearing gloves. He laughed. A real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere deeper than social performance, the kind she had heard for the first time when Yuna had declared her opinions about wolves. It was still her favorite sound in the world, and she suspected it always would be. They left the fundraiser early, slipping out through a side entrance while the crowd was still mingling, and drove home through streets that were wet with the remnants of an afternoon rain. The city glittered around them, and Savannah watched its lights pass and thought about the strange alchemy of a life that had taken her from Macon, Georgia, to a parking garage in Queens, to a clifftop in Jeju, to this moment, this car, this man whose deep water she had learned to swim in without losing herself. At home, they changed out of their formal clothes and into the soft, shapeless garments that constituted the uniform of their private life. Kale made tea. Savannah sat on the kitchen counter, which she knew he found mildly distressing for reasons related to hygiene and surface maintenance, and watched him move through the ritual with the same precision he brought to everything. Yuna called while you were in the shower, he said, setting her cup beside her. She wants to know if we can take her to the aquarium this weekend. She has developed an interest in octopuses. Octopi. She was very specific that the correct plural is octopuses. She has done research. Savannah smiled, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. She gets that from you. The research, the specificity, the absolute certainty that she is right about everything. She gets that from you, Kale corrected. I am never certain. I simply prepare until uncertainty becomes irrelevant. They were quiet for a moment, the kitchen filled with the small sounds of a home at rest, the tick of the clock above the stove, the distant hum of the city beyond the windows, the particular quality of silence that exists between two people who have weathered something together and come out holding hands on the other side. Thank you, Savannah said. Kale looked at her, his cup halfway to his lips. For what? For hearing me. When I said, do not make it about vengeance. You heard me. Even when I changed my mind, even when I told you to do it, you still did it your way. Precisely. Strategically. Without becoming something we could not live with. She paused, turning the words over before releasing them. You showed him what he was standing on, and you let him choose. That is not destruction, Kale. That is grace. He set down his cup and moved to stand in front of her, his hands finding their natural resting place on her knees, his thumbs tracing absent patterns on the fabric of her sweatpants. From this position, sitting on the counter, they were exactly the same height, and Savannah found herself looking directly into the eyes she had first seen across a hospital bed 8 years ago. I almost did not choose Grace, he said quietly. When I saw Yuna in that hospital bed, when I understood what he had done, I wanted to take everything from him. Not strategically. Not precisely. I wanted to burn it down and let him watch. He held her gaze. You are the reason I did not. Not because you told me not to, but because I kept asking myself what you would think of the man who did that. And I wanted to be the man you married, not the one his enemies are afraid of. Savannah reached up and placed her hands on either side of his face, the way she always did when she needed him to hear her with more than his ears. You are both, she said. You have always been both, and I married both. The man who dances with me to Debussy, and the man who can buy a city before breakfast. I do not need you to choose between them. I need you to let me love both of them. Kale closed his eyes, and she felt something release in him. A tension so old and so deeply held that its absence changed the shape of his face. When he opened his eyes again, they were bright with something he would never have let anyone else see. Octopuses, he said. What? She is right. The technically correct plural from the Greek is octopodes, but octopuses is the accepted English form. Octopi is Latin hypercorrection. Savannah stared at him for a full 3 seconds. Then she laughed. The same surprised, helpless laugh that had echoed off concrete walls 8 years ago and changed the course of both their lives. She pulled him close and kissed him, tasting tea and tenderness and the quiet, irreducible stubbornness of a man who would research the plural of octopus at 11 o'clock at night because his 12-year-old niece had an opinion about it. Outside, the city settled into its nighttime rhythms, lights dimming in windows, streets emptying. Somewhere in that city, Bellamy Hargrove was sitting in a study that suddenly felt smaller than it had a month ago, contemplating a future that looked very different from the one he had always assumed was guaranteed. And somewhere else, in a kitchen that smelled like chamomile and certainty, a woman who held children's hearts for a living held her husband's face in her hands and felt, with the bone-deep knowledge of someone who had spent her life diagnosing what was broken and fixing it, that this, all of this, was whole. It was not perfect. It was not uncomplicated. But it was theirs. Built from a parking garage and a 4-year-old's heartbeat and a rainy night, and a name spoken like a declaration in a room full of people who would never forget the sound of it. Dr. Savannah Okafor. And the man who made sure the world remembered.